This is the Dietary Analysis Final Project for John Weaver, Nutrition 100 Elements of Nutrition, June 26, 2016. The subject's data. Subject of this dietary analysis is a 30-year-old woman who is about 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighs exactly 175.2 pounds. The subject exercises about 4 days a week for approximately 20 to 30 minutes. Her activity of choice is walking or light jogging, and occasionally she'll run on an elliptical. It is important to note that the subject is currently 10 weeks pregnant. Prior to the interview, the subject noted that her diet remains vastly unchanged from pre-pregnancy, aside from the addition of some processed carbohydrates. Her daily dietary intake is as follows. She begins with breakfast at around 7 a.m. Her breakfast consists of a half a whole wheat bagel by Nature's Own, 2 teaspoons of cream cheese by the Food Line brand, a slice of fresh cantaloupe, approximately 2 ounces, 1 hard-boiled egg with the yolk removed, and 4 ounces of whole-fat milk. Her next meal is lunch. Ooh, that went too fast. Love PowerPoint. Her next meal is lunch, and for lunch, she has about 8 ounces of water, half a Red Delicious apple cut into slices, 1 cup of quinoa brown rice blend by Seeds of Change, 2 ounces of grilled chicken chopped, and a 1/4 cup of shredded cheddar cheese. Her next snack is around 3 o'clock, between 3 and 4 o'clock. She pointed out that at this point in the interview, she pointed out she consumes water throughout the day and wanted to give me a breakdown of her water, which I'll talk about a little bit later. At this point, it was her snack at about 3:30. Again, she had half a Red Delicious apple cut into slices, a handful of pecans, which came out to, she believes, about 1 ounce, 3 slices of, a bunch of slices of cheddar cheese that came out to about 3 ounces, and approximately 8 ounces of water. For dinner at around 7 o'clock, she had 1 link of chicken sausage, the Kirkland brand, came out to about between 3 and 3.5 ounces. 1 whole wheat hot dog bun from Nature's Own, a handful of green beans, which she estimates to be about 2 ounces, and several slices of red and green peppers, which in total she believes to be about 1 ounce. By the end of the day, she has estimated that she consumed about 132 ounces of water. Her water intake is very important to her because she's pregnant. She was adamant about me including this. She would estimate that on average she does between 130 and 150 ounces of water a day. She has a 33-ounce Camelback water bottle that she continually fills, and she tries to set goals for herself through the day. Every 3 or 4 hours, she wants to finish that Camelback. And through the course of the day, she wants to finish it at least 4 times, which is about 140 ounces, I think. The initial dietary analysis for the subject, my predictions for the subject, are initially I was impressed by it, by her diet. Upon learning when I learned she was pregnant, I assumed her diet would be littered with random cravings and such. Her diet, however, is quite balanced and lacks any of the treats I expected to hear about. She did repeatedly mention that early in the week she had experienced lapses of willpower, but for the most part, her diet is consistent and balanced and reflected of the general MyPlate expectations, I think. Each meal, aside from dinner, included a serving of dairy for a total of 3 servings. Her snack of cheddar cheese exceeded the recommended serving size. In my estimation, aside from the large snack serving, she consumed an appropriate amount of dairy in a 24-hour period. Her serving sizes minus the cheese snack are all in accordance with the recommended values. Although each meal included at least 1 serving of food from the MyPlate group, I noticed that she only had half a serving of fruit with both lunch and snack. I do not want to say she's lacking in fruit, but it may be advantageous to increase that to a full serving with her meal rather than half. I also believe she should be including more whole grains, such as the quinoa that she had for lunch in her diet. Aside from those few suggestions, I think her diet is quite balanced and quite admirable, actually. And it's free from a lot of the processed and sugar-added temptations that truly haunt us when you go to the grocery store. They're just right there. Ooh, sorry. My plate recommendations. In order to better analyze the diet of the subject, all items were recorded from her daily intake all the items that were recorded from her daily intake were put into the USDA Super Tracker program. The Super Tracker program analyzes your daily intake, and it in turn gives you a personalized nutrition plan. It gives tips and support to help make better and healthier choices. It analyzes the foods for nutrient content. It breaks down and recommends physical activities, and it breaks down your daily calorie limit, and it breaks down what you eat into the food group targets and gives you an idea of what you're eating. So after inputting those values, the first slide here is breaking down the daily food group targets. According to the daily food group targets, the subject is lacking in her intake of vegetables. Seems like a pretty large amount, actually. And in addition to this, she's consuming too much protein. This chart is simple, and it doesn't really analyze what the problems may be. So you then take down the breakdown of the food group intake. And it's here where you can really see the problems. This graph better shows the insufficient intake of vegetables. It also indicates that the overabundance of protein in the diet may not be that bad, but it's still a problem. It further breaks down, showing that the refined grains are about 17% of her intake, and the whole grains are about 83% of the intake of the grains as a whole. The breakdown of dairy is 84% cheese and 16% milk. Without any analytics, it's pretty clear that the subject's intake of dairy is unbalanced and will need adjustment. This is actually contrary to the initial understanding that the subject's dairy intake was adequate. The next slide will break down the daily limits. Here you see that she's well under her calorie limit. She basically doesn't ingest any added sugar. The issue that is glaring is the saturated fat. Although the subject's calorie intake is below the recommended daily value, her intake of saturated fat is actually at 155% of the daily recommended value. This will most certainly need to be adjusted. My plate conclusion. Here I feel that despite the results, I still think she is much healthier in her eating habits than the average American, especially considering she's pregnant and constantly fighting cravings. Saying that, the subject needs to increase her intake of vegetables and cut back on protein. At the same time, she was below her daily calorie intake limits, but exceeded the limit for saturated fats. So balancing that is going to be a problem. I believe cutting back on cheese will help, certainly in saturated fats. Additionally, the subject needs to find a way to fit more vegetables into her diet. I was correct in my prediction that she does not consume many refined grains and added sugars, but there's still going to need to be adjustments to help bring down saturated fats. It'll be interesting to see how decreasing the saturated fats and increasing the vegetable intake will affect the overall nutrient intake of the subject. My recommended dietary intake adjustments are pretty drastic. This slide right here simply shows what she was eating and drinking before. Clearly, she was deficient in areas and had surplus in others. So I want to see if I can't change this. So my recommendation was this. To highlight a couple of the changes, I added a banana in to get some potassium in. Her lunch is basically a salad now to really increase on the grains. I'm sorry, not the grains, the vegetables, which may be an issue because you really need protein for energy, but hopefully she can mix the snack in, or really try hard to get the snacks in between breakfast and lunch to get that protein. The dinner is loaded with protein, with black beans, shredded chicken, the chopped green pepper. The snacks are significantly more healthy, in my opinion. I've basically completely removed the cheese. This is the daily food group targets for the adjusted meal plan. As you can see, the vegetables and the dairy are both over. Vegetables were completely deficient before, and dairy is now. If I had an issue changing the dairy because it really affects something I'll talk about later. It really affects the nutrient and vitamin intake. So I found that even though they're over, it's best. Something to note for this: with the adjustments, the subject now has an adequate intake of daily vegetables. The subject has also decreased the amount of protein. Each of these adjustments had a significant impact on nutrient intake, and we'll see that a little bit later. Dairy intake and vegetable intake are now over, but are not in extreme excess. This was really necessary to bring the nutrient intake up to acceptable ranges, and for the third time, we'll talk about that later. The breakdown of the adjusted food group shows that now the subject is supplied with sufficient amounts of each food group. Milk and yogurt intake are on the high side again, but there's no yogurt there. The intake of grains are now 100% whole grains, and the dairy is now 100% milk. This is due to the elimination of cheese and its high content of saturated fat. To replace the cheese, an increased intake of milk was recommended. A simple adjustment would be to cut half a cup from each serving. However, this is certainly going to impact the nutrient intake of vitamin D, which is already below the suggested limits, which we'll talk about later. According to my plate, the intake of vegetables should be averaged over a week period. I wanted to point this out. Quote unquote, vegetable subgroup recommendations are given as amounts to eat weekly. It is not necessary to eat vegetables from each subgroup daily. However, over a week, try to consume the amounts listed from each subgroup as a way to reach your daily intake recommendations. That's directly from the USDA on the My Plate page. It is my recommendation that the subject may, on this specific day, ingest the amounts of vegetables listed. The remainder of the week, she may want to cut back a little bit. The adjusted daily limits. The adjusted diet has drastically reduced the amount of saturated fat. The adjustments have also had an increase on her calories and sodium. The total increases are notable, but even though it is over the daily limit, it is only negligible. Something of note, the sodium content in the tap water she was drinking, according to the USDA, is 9 milligrams per 8 ounces of water. The changes in the diet will require the subject to no longer consume tap water. Tap water apparently has not high salt, but the amounts of water she's drinking is giving her more salt than is recommended, significantly more. So no more tap water. There is a recommendation where the subject is probably going to need to continue to consume water. Well, it's definitely going to need to continue to consume water, but now she's going to want to switch to a natural spring water like Deer Park or something like that, which has very little sodium to it. My initial adjustment conclusions are as follows. The original diet had a large amount of cheese, which led to high levels of saturated fat and increased cholesterol. It was recommended that there be an increase in vegetables and leafy greens to help increase levels of vitamins and minerals deficient from the previous diet. The levels of fat and cholesterol were lowered, as well as the intake in refined grains. Although not perfect, the subsequent recommendations are a vast improvement over the previous submission. In the end, the lack of certain nutrients and vitamins in the patient's diet may require supplementation to bring within acceptable ranges. She's pregnant. She's probably going to want to take dietary supplements anyway. Nutrients. Here's the fun part. This is where I had a blast trying to get these within ranges, and I went a little crazy. As you can see, on the left side is the initial nutrient intake, and on the right is the adjusted meal plan with the adjusted nutrient intake. Something of note really stood out to me. It really stood out was initially the diet the subject consumed seemed quite admirable, considering the average American consumes in a day. But if you look at the vitamins here, she was deficient in all of them, from top to bottom, except riboflavin. that for a pregnant woman is probably not very good. Um, I wanted to note a couple of the minerals on this page as well. I'll talk about it as a whole. So, initially, the diet the subject consumed seemed quite admirable considering the average American diet. Um, until you look closely at what the food consumed actually contains in regards to nutrients. The subject's initial diet was deficient in every vitamin category, as well as the minerals of potassium and iron. While attempting, as you can see here, while attempting to adjust the meal plan for the subject, simply changing the amounts of what she was eating failed to adequately correct the problems. Uh, Even after completely scrapping the meal plan, I still had problems keeping certain nutrients within acceptable ranges. This new meal plan, I want to point out a couple of the major ones. As you can see, copper was 234.5%. A healthy diet includes leafy greens and vegetables. And fortunately, copper is prevalent in almost every vegetable in the diet, especially the kale that I said she should include. Adjusting the levels of vegetables brings the unacceptable ranges of the daily food groups. The body has the ability to dispose of excess copper, but there are most certainly risks. So, as long as the body's processing the copper, that these are within ranges. If something of note for copper is this: copper is copper is an example of a heavy metal that's extremely toxic at higher levels. And in excess, copper has been linked to oxidative stress and brain damage that may lead to cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. Phosphorus, being at 267%, was in just about everything in the diet, to be honest with you. The milk, cheese, beans, and many of the vegetables contain the mineral, making it difficult to control the intake. However, proper kidney functions filter out and dispose of any excess of the mineral. Still, high levels of phosphorus can affect your body's ability to effectively use other minerals, such as iron, calcium, magnesium, zinc. It can combine with the calcium, causing mineral deposits to form in your muscles. It's a problem. Something else that needs to be watched. Selenium was at 208%. It is possible, depending on the area where the grain was grown for the bagel, because that's where most of the selenium came from, that the levels of selenium in this diet are not excessively out of range. Still, possibly replacing the bagel or chicken, which also had some selenium, with a different food group item could lower the selenium, but again, it's going to affect other things. The amount of selenium necessary in an individual's diet is dependent upon their age as well. The problem is that extremely high intakes of selenium can cause severe problems, including a difficulty breathing, tremors, kidney failure, heart attacks, and possibly heart failure. Again, healthy kidney function should help filter out any excess selenium. The vitamin A, which was at 247%, really kind of jumped out at me. The carrots contain a large amount of vitamin A. Maybe possibly replacing the carrots with celery or another vegetable will assist in lowering these levels, but those will affect other areas of mineral and vitamin intake. The NIH indicates that levels listed in the analysis of my chart may not be exact. They indicate that for people over the age of 20, 3,000 RAE are acceptable, which would put her well within the range. Overall, the remaining nutrient intakes are within somewhat acceptable ranges, nothing completely out of control. Remembering that this is only 1 day's worth of a diet can bring some perspective into the amounts ingested as well. My final conclusion. According to the USDA, typical eating patterns currently consumed by many Americans simply do not align with dietary guidelines. About 3/4 of the population has an eating pattern that is low in vegetables, fruit, dairy, and oils. More than half of the population is meeting or exceeding total grains and total protein foods recommendations, but are not meeting the recommendations for the subgroups within each of these food groups. Most Americans exceed the recommended recommendations for added sugars, saturated fats, and sodium. Americans, on average, just aren't healthy. It is possible this recommended adjustment to the subject's diet is too healthy. The presence of excess vitamins and minerals in this diet can indicate that the diet is not within ranges of what would be described by the USDA as a healthy diet. It is concerning that the levels of macro and micronutrients are so responsive to what is best described as only a small change in what you're eating. Simply adjusting a portion size often isn't enough. In conclusion, the perfect daily food intake for one day simply is not possible. Any individual wishing to eat a healthy diet must understand that healthy eating is something that is done over the course of time. The balance of nutrient intake, daily recommended values of calories, sugars, saturated fat, dairy, vegetables, fruits, grains, and proteins is not an easy thing. Certainly not trying to do it in one day. Being aware of what you eat and tracking what you ingest is certainly a step in the right direction. And the Super Tracker helps you do that. If you ingest too much of something one day, just understand you may need to avoid it the next day, or at least decrease it. If there is something to be taken from this analysis, it is everything in moderation. And this seems to be a theme of Nutrient as a whole. Thank you for taking the time, and I hope this message finds you well. I will attach to this submission a breakdown of what I talked about, as well as the two nutrient intakes shown here. Any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out. I will also attach a works cited page at the end. Thank you.